This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. The Martinez family was the kind of family that seemed to have it all. Living in a sprawling Mediterranean-style home in Sarasota, Florida, their lives were bathed in the golden light of privilege. Their neighborhood, an affluent enclave with perfectly trimmed palm trees and white picket fences, was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where neighbors exchanged smiles at morning yoga classes and gossiped good-naturedly over iced lattes at the local cafe. The Martinez house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, its terracotta roof gleaming under the Florida sun and its lush front yard meticulously maintained by a weekly landscaping crew. It was a picture of stability and prosperity, a postcard-perfect image of the American dream. But like so many things that appeared flawless on the surface, cracks lay hidden beneath the polished exterior. Inside the Martinez home, the energy was vibrant, almost chaotic, with the kind of liveliness that comes from having 4 teenage girls under one roof. Gabriella, the eldest at 17, was the undeniable star of the family. Tall, poised, and radiant, she carried herself with an effortless confidence that made people gravitate toward her. She was the golden child, excelling in everything she touched: academics, sports, music, and social life. Gabriella was the captain of her high school's debate team, a straight-A student and a budding pianist who played flawlessly at school recitals. She had a natural charisma that made her the darling of her parents and the envy of her peers. Teachers adored her, coaches relied on her, and her parents often joked that she was destined for greatness. To her siblings, however, her perfection. Isabel Martinez, 16, was the second oldest daughter, and her life seemed to revolve around the space Gabriella didn't occupy. Where Gabriella was outgoing and social, Isabel was reserved and introspective. Her dark brown hair, often tied into a loose braid, framed a delicate face marked by sharp features and deep-set hazel eyes. Isabel had always been quieter, preferring the company of her sketchbook to the clamor of the family dining table. Her art was her refuge, her way of expressing emotions she couldn't voice. She had talent, real talent, but it was a quiet kind, the kind that went unnoticed in a house dominated by Gabriella's shining achievements. Isabel felt invisible much of the time, her efforts eclipsed by her older sister's relentless success. She didn't resent Gabriella for being exceptional, at least that's what she told herself. And she was most definitely in her element. She didn't need Captain Cox's help. At least that's what she told herself, but deep down, the comparisons, both spoken and unspoken, had begun to weigh on her, a subtle pressure that grew heavier with every passing year. Then there was Sophia, 14 years old, who seemed to exist in her own world of youthful exuberance. With her honey blonde hair always in a messy ponytail and her braces gleaming in the Florida sun, Sophia was the embodiment of teenage energy. She was bubbly, outgoing, and endlessly optimistic, the kind of person who made friends easily and never seemed to take anything too seriously. She adored Gabriella, idolized her even, and was always eager to mimic her older sister's style and mannerisms. To Isabel, Sophia's cheerfulness often felt grating, her laughter a constant reminder of the joy Isabel struggled to feel in herself. Sophia's role in the family was the peacemaker, the one who smoothed over arguments and diffused tension with a joke or a hug. But in Isabel's mind, her sister's endless positivity only added to the illusion that their family was perfect, a falsehood Isabel had long stopped believing. The youngest, 12, Emily, was the baby of the family, a fact she both embraced and exploited. With her wide, innocent eyes and soft, round cheeks, Emily had a knack for getting her way. She was the most sheltered of the 4 sisters, often doted on by their parents, who saw her as a symbol of their family's happiness. Emily was still in that awkward phase between childhood and adolescence, her room filled with stuffed animals and posters of cartoon characters. She followed her older sisters around like a shadow, particularly Gabriella, who she worshipped with the kind of blind admiration only a younger sibling could have. But while Emily's innocence endeared her to everyone in the family, it also made her an easy target for Isabel's frustrations. Emily's wide-eyed trust and dependence on her older sisters were traits that Isabel couldn't help but view with a mix of pity and disdain. At the center of it all were Antonio and Marisol Martinez, the girls' parents, who took great pride in their family's accomplishments. Antonio was a successful real estate developer, known for his charming smile and ability to close a deal. He was the kind of father who loved to show off his daughters at dinner parties, bragging about Gabriella's latest achievements, or Emily's adorable antics. Marisol, on the other hand, was a stay-at-home mother who managed the household with precision. She was the glue that held everything together, orchestrating the girls' schedules, helping with homework, and ensuring that the house was always spotless. Marisol had grown up in a modest immigrant family, and she had worked hard to create a life of comfort and stability for her children. To her, the Martinez family represented everything she had dreamed of achieving, and she worked tirelessly to maintain that image. She did terrible things up to this point in her life that left her stubborn and evasive, but this was temporary, and she focused on that image. But while Antonio and Marisol were devoted parents, their attention often felt unevenly distributed. Gabriella, as the eldest and most accomplished, naturally commanded much of their focus. Emily, as the youngest, received the kind of coddling reserved for the family's baby. Even Sophia, with her bubbly personality, seemed to get more recognition than Isabel, whose quiet nature often left her overlooked. Isabel couldn't help but notice the way her parents' eyes lit up when Gabriella spoke, or how quickly they dismissed her own attempts to share her art or ideas. It wasn't that they didn't love her, she knew they did, but their love felt distant, like a spotlight that occasionally brushed against her before moving on to brighter subjects. The Martinez household, though outwardly harmonious, was a pressure cooker of expectations, competition, and unspoken resentments. The sisters were close in age but vastly different in personality, and while their relationships were outwardly affectionate, tension simmered beneath the surface. Arguments over trivial things, borrowing clothes, hogging the bathroom, stealing the TV remote, often escalated into full-blown fights. Gabriella's dominance over the household set the tone, leaving the younger sisters to navigate their own places within the family dynamic. Isabel, caught between Gabriella's perfection and Sophia's charm, felt like an outsider in her own home, her presence acknowledged but rarely celebrated. Sarasota, with its pristine beaches and sun-soaked streets, served as the perfect backdrop for the Martinez family's seemingly idyllic life. The house was filled with laughter, the scent of Marisol's cooking, and the buzz of four sisters navigating their teenage years. But for Isabel, the brightness of Florida's endless summer felt oppressive, like a spotlight she could never escape. As the days passed, her frustrations grew harder to contain, her resentment burrowing deeper into her mind. The Martinez family's perfect image was beginning to crack, and Isabel, whether she realized it or not, was the fault line. The unraveling began on a sweltering August afternoon, during one of those family gatherings that Marisol Martinez loved to host. The house was full of relatives, tanned uncles with booming voices, aunts in flowery dresses, cousins running in and out of the backyard pool. The scent of grilled food wafted through the air, mixing with the salty breeze that drifted in through the open windows. Hermospace was on Billabong, with participants were not always federal. Hermospace was laughter echoed off the tiled walls of the sprawling house as conversations overlapped in a chaotic symphony of familial warmth. But for Isabel, the day felt suffocating. The noise, the heat, the smiling faces, all of it pressed down on her like a weight she couldn't shake. Isabel had always hated these gatherings. It wasn't that she disliked her extended family, but their presence only amplified the things she hated most about herself. These were the moments when comparisons came alive, when Gabriella was paraded around like a prized thoroughbred, while Isabel faded into the background. And as always, Gabriella thrived under the attention. She moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of someone used to being admired, her laughter infectious, her stories carefully calibrated to impress. She basked in the glow of her relatives' praise, while Isabel lingered on the edges, clutching a glass of lemonade and wishing she could disappear. The turning point came later in the afternoon during lunch. The family was gathered around the long dining table, plates piled high with empanadas, grilled chicken, and bowls of colorful salads. Gabriella, seated near the center of the table, was telling a story about a recent debate competition she had won, her voice animated and confident. The story was met with applause and admiration from the adults, who hung on her every word. "Ah," Ren said, looking up at her, his gray smile calling eloquently to her hat. Isabel sat several seats away, quietly picking at her food, hoping to go unnoticed. But as Gabriella's story ended, one of their uncles turned to Isabel and asked her if she'd been working on anything lately. For a brief moment, Isabel felt a flicker of hope. Someone had noticed her. She quickly mentioned her latest art project, a piece she'd been pouring her heart into for weeks, inspired by the Florida sunsets she loved to sketch from her bedroom window. She described the vivid colors, the intricate details, her vision for the final piece. But before she could finish, Gabriella interrupted with a teasing laugh. "Oh." Isabel froze, her cheeks burning as the laughter spread. She glanced around the table, hoping someone would defend her, but no one did. Even Marisol smiled awkwardly, brushing it off as harmless sibling teasing. Gabriella, emboldened by the laughter, leaned into the moment, poking more fun at Isabel's art until her words felt like tiny knives digging into Isabel's chest. It wasn't the first time Gabriella had mocked her, but something about this moment felt different. It was public, humiliating, a reminder of how little she mattered in the grand scheme of their family. After the laughter died down, Isabel forced a tight smile and excused herself from the table, her appetite gone. She slipped out of the house and into the backyard, finding a quiet spot by the edge of the pool. The sound of splashing water and distant laughter carried on behind her, but Isabel tuned it out, staring blankly at the rippling surface of the pool. Her chest felt tight, her throat constricted, and she could feel tears welling up in her eyes. She hated crying, hated how weak it made her feel, but in that moment, she couldn't stop the flood of emotions. It wasn't just Gabriella's teasing that hurt. It was everything it represented. Her parents had laughed, her sisters had laughed, and no one had come to her defense. It was as though her feelings didn't matter, as though her entire existence was something to be brushed aside. In that moment, she felt an overwhelming sense of isolation, a deep chasm between her and the rest of her family. She thought about how hard she had worked on that painting, how much she had wanted someone to see her for who she was, but no one ever looked. No one ever cared. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized this wasn't just about Gabriella. It was about all of them. Her parents, her sisters, her relatives. They had all contributed to this feeling, this unbearable sense of being invisible. But the final blow came later that night. After the relatives had left and the house had quieted down, Isabel was tidying up her room when she noticed something out of place on her desk. It was her application packet for a prestigious summer art program, a program she had been dreaming of attending for years. She had poured hours into perfecting her portfolio, writing her essays, and gathering letters of recommendation. But now, as she flipped through the papers, she realized something was missing. The most important piece of her portfolio, a detailed sketch that had taken her weeks to complete, was gone. Panic gripped her as she searched her room, tearing through drawers and flipping over piles of papers, but the sketch was nowhere to be found. She felt a sinking dread in her stomach, a gnawing sense that something wasn't right. And then, almost as if on cue, Gabriella's voice echoed in her mind, mocking her earlier at the table. Isabel's chest tightened as a horrible suspicion took root. She stormed into Gabriella's room, her heart pounding, and began rifling through her sister's things. She found the sketch crumpled in a drawer, its edges torn, the image smeared, as though someone had deliberately destroyed it. Isabel stared at the ruined piece, her hands trembling with rage. It wasn't just a prank. It was sabotage, a deliberate act of cruelty designed to undermine her. Gabriella had always been the star, but this was something else. This was a calculated effort to keep Isabel in the shadows, to remind her of her place. Isabel's vision blurred with tears as she clutched the ruined drawing, her mind racing with anger, hurt, and a growing sense of betrayal. That night, Isabel lay awake in bed, her thoughts spiraling into darker and darker places. She thought about all the times she had been dismissed, ignored, mocked, and overlooked. She thought about Gabriella, Sophia, and Emily, about how they had always seemed to take up all the space in the family, leaving none for her. She thought about her parents, who never seemed to notice her pain. And as the hours passed, the anger inside her began to harden into something colder, something sharper. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Isabel had made a decision, though she didn't yet fully understand what it would mean. All she knew was that something had to change, and she was done waiting for anyone else to make it happen. The plan began to take shape slowly, almost imperceptibly, in the days that followed the discovery of her ruined sketch. Isabel Martinez had always been a quiet observer, someone who noticed the subtle details others overlooked. She knew the rhythms of her household better than anyone, the patterns of her sister's movements, the habits her parents were blind to, the little moments when the household was vulnerable, when no one was paying attention. What started as a simmering anger grew into a cold determination, and with it came the realization that her only path to peace was to remove the obstacles she believed were ruining her life. Her sisters. It wasn't a decision Isabel came to all at once. At first, her thoughts were unfocused, a storm of emotions she couldn't quite pin down. But as the days turned into weeks, those emotions began to crystallize into something more concrete. She started to rationalize her anger, convincing herself that Gabriella, Sophia, and Emily were the source of everything wrong in her life. They weren't just sisters, they were rivals, each one complicit in her erasure. The memories of Gabriella's mocking laughter, Sophia's endless cheerfulness, and Emily's naive adoration all blurred together in Isabel's mind, feeding a narrative of betrayal and exclusion. She began to see herself as a victim of their presence, a prisoner in her own home. And so, with a growing sense of clarity, Isabel decided she would take control. She would do what she believed no one else had the courage to do: end the cycle of neglect and humiliation. Isabel approached her plan like she approached her art, meticulously, with an obsessive attention to detail. She knew that if she made even one mistake, everything would unravel and she would be exposed. Her sisters would have to die in ways that seemed natural, accidents that no one would question. She couldn't afford to let suspicion fall on her. Not when the whole family already saw her as fragile and withdrawn. She needed to stay invisible, to remain the quiet, overlooked sister no one thought capable of anything malicious. That invisibility was her greatest weapon. The first step was gathering knowledge. Isabel began to pay closer attention to her sister's routines, making mental notes of their habits and vulnerabilities. She noticed how Emily always took her nightly glass of milk to bed, leaving it on her nightstand before falling asleep. She observed how Sophia spent hours in the backyard pool, often without telling anyone, trusting that someone would eventually check on her. Gabriella, ever the perfectionist, had a rigid schedule, often staying up late to work on school projects or practicing piano long after everyone else had gone to bed. Isabel cataloged these details with the precision of a scientist, filing them away until they could be put to use. Next came the tools. Isabel knew she couldn't rely on brute force. She wasn't physically strong enough to overpower her sisters, and any sign of a struggle would immediately draw suspicion. Instead, she turned to subtle methods, researching poisons and toxins that could be obtained without raising alarms. She spent hours on the internet, combing through obscure forums and medical websites, learning about substances that could mimic natural causes of death. She discovered how common household items could be repurposed, how certain over-the-counter medications, when combined, could become lethal. Her research was exhaustive, meticulous, and hidden. Her laptop always wiped clean of any incriminating searches. Her next challenge was timing. Isabel knew she couldn't act impulsively. Each death had to be spaced out, giving the family time to grieve and lower their guard. Striking too quickly would only invite scrutiny, something she couldn't afford. She planned for months, rehearsing each step of her plan in her mind, envisioning every possible scenario and how she would respond. The early morning dawned. She would head for a farm. She'd have a ceremony for some sort of... She practiced small acts of deception to test herself, telling her parents she had finished her homework when she hadn't, claiming she had been in her room all afternoon when she'd actually been spying on her sisters. Each lie was a tiny rehearsal, a way to build her confidence and ensure she wouldn't falter when it mattered most. Isabel's first target was Emily, the youngest and most trusting of the three. Emily's nightly routine was predictable to the point of monotony. She would drink a glass of milk before bed, then fall asleep with her nightlight on, clutching one of her stuffed animals. Isabel decided to lace Emily's milk with a small amount of poison, just enough to cause her heart to stop in her sleep. It was a clean, quiet method, one that wouldn't arouse suspicion. Isabel practiced the motion of pouring the poison into the glass, rehearsing how she would act if someone walked in. She even practiced her expression in the mirror, perfecting a look of grief and shock for when her parents inevitably discovered Emily's lifeless body. Sophia was next. Isabel had always resented Sophia's relentless cheerfulness, her ability to light up a room without even trying. The pool, Isabel decided, would be the perfect setting for her second accident. Sophia often swam alone in the afternoons, sometimes staying in the water long after the rest of the family had gone inside. Isabel planned to tamper with the pool's drain system, creating a suction strong enough to trap Sophia underwater. It would look like a tragic drowning, a freak accident that no one could have predicted. Isabel spent weeks learning how the pool's mechanisms worked, studying the manuals she found in the garage and testing the system when no one was watching. By the time she was ready, she knew the pool's operations better than anyone in the family. Gabriella, the eldest and most formidable of her sisters, would require a different approach. Gabriella's room was on the second floor, with a balcony that overlooked the backyard. Isabel decided to stage a fall, an accident that could be explained by Gabriella's late-night habit of pacing the balcony while on her phone. Isabel planned to tamper with the balcony railing, loosening the screws so that it would give way under Gabriella's weight. She would wait until a stormy night, when the wet wood would make the scenario even more plausible. Isabel knew this final step would be the most challenging, not only because Gabriella was so observant, but because this was the sister who had hurt her the most. The thought of Gabriella's mocking laughter fueled Isabel's resolve, driving her to perfect every detail of her plan. "Isabel," Gregory said. By the time Isabel was ready to act, she had rehearsed every step in her mind countless times. She knew where to stand, what to say, how to feign grief when the time came. Her plan wasn't just about killing her sisters. It was about erasing the parts of her life that had made her feel invisible, silenced, and unimportant. In her mind, she wasn't just committing murder. She was reclaiming her place in the world, carving out space for herself in a family that had always pushed her aside. And as the days ticked closer to the moment she would put her plan into motion, Isabel felt something she hadn't felt in years. Control. The murders began with a horrifying simplicity, a quiet and deliberate chain of events that transformed Isabel's fantasies into a grim reality. Emily, the youngest, was the first to die. Isabel had always considered her the easiest target, not because of any fault of Emily's, but because of her innocence and trust. Emily adored all of her older sisters, and Isabel had been no exception. She would follow her around the house, eager to help with her art projects, or sit quietly in Isabel's room as she sketched. Isabel exploited this trust with a cold detachment that shocked even herself. The poison she had chosen, extracted from a combination of household products, was subtle, undetectable by taste or smell, and would mimic a sudden cardiac arrest. Isabel spent days preparing for this first kill, rehearsing the steps in her mind until she felt numb to the enormity of what she was about to do. The night it happened was unremarkable, like any other in the Martinez household. The family had gathered for dinner, and the conversation was lighthearted. Isabel barely spoke, as usual, but no one noticed her silence. After dinner, Emily followed her usual routine, pouring herself a glass of milk and curling up on the couch with a book. Isabel watched her from the corner of the room, waiting for the right moment. When Emily left the glass unattended to grab a blanket from her room, Isabel struck. Her hands were steady as she poured the poison into the milk, stirring it just enough to ensure it dissolved completely. By the time Emily returned, Isabel was already seated at the dining table, sketching idly as though nothing had happened. Emily drank the milk without hesitation, chatting about a movie she wanted to watch that weekend. Isabel didn't respond, barely looking up from her sketchbook as her youngest sister unknowingly swallowed her death. That night, Emily went to bed as usual, her glass of milk left half-finished on the nightstand. By morning, she was dead. When Marisol found her, the house erupted into chaos. Antonio called 911, Marisol sobbed uncontrollably, and Gabriela and Sofia hovered helplessly in the hallway, their faces pale with shock. Isabel played her part perfectly, sitting on the edge of her bed, with her head in her hands, tears streaming down her face. She told herself she wasn't crying for Emily. She couldn't allow herself that weakness, but for the fact that her plan was now in motion, unstoppable and irreversible. The autopsy concluded that Emily had died of sudden cardiac arrest, a tragedy that no one could have foreseen. The family was shattered, but there was no suspicion of foul play. Isabel's careful planning had worked. Still, the weight of what she had done lingered in the air, pressing down on her even as she moved on to the next phase of her plan. She told herself it would get easier, that the first step was always the hardest, but the reality was far more complicated. Sofia's death came weeks later, during a lazy Sunday afternoon when the house was quiet and the Florida sun beat down mercilessly on the backyard. Sofia, as usual, had decided to spend the afternoon swimming, a routine Isabel had come to rely on. She had already tampered with the pool's drain system days before, adjusting it to create a powerful suction that could easily trap someone underwater. She had tested it late one night when everyone else was asleep, satisfied with the results but unnerved by the sheer force of the water pulling against her hand. Now she watched from the kitchen window as Sofia floated on her back, her blonde hair fanned out around her like a halo. The timing had to be perfect. Isabel waited until Sofia was near the deep end, where the drain was strongest, before slipping outside unnoticed. The pool was surrounded by a tall privacy fence, and the house was quiet. Antonio and Marisol were out running errands, and Gabriela was upstairs, engrossed in a phone call. Isabel approached the edge of the pool, pretending to adjust a chair nearby. She got adjusted her computer and approached the web button to adjust it. Antonio and Marisol were watching her on the screen, as if she was waiting for her. When Sofia saw her, she smiled, waving enthusiastically. Isabel forced herself to wave back, her heart pounding in her chest. As Sofia turned away to float again, Isabel flipped the switch on the pool's control panel, activating the drain's maximum suction. Sofia didn't notice at first, but within moments, Isabel saw her body jerk in the water as the force of the drain pulled her downward. She thrashed, her arms flailing as she tried to swim away, but the suction was too strong. Isabel stood frozen, watching the scene unfold with a mix of horror and fascination. Sofia's struggle lasted only minutes, though it felt like an eternity to Isabel. When her sister's body finally went limp, Isabel turned off the drain and stepped back inside the house, her hands trembling as she closed the sliding door behind her. The discovery of Sofia's body was another shock to the family. Gabriela found her first, screaming so loudly that neighbors rushed outside, craning their necks to see what had happened. Antonio and Marisol returned home moments later, their grief fresh and raw as they held Sofia's lifeless body in their arms. Isabel stayed in the background, silent and wide-eyed, her face a perfect mask of disbelief. One of them stopped to turn on the TV to make sure he hadn't left the house on his own. Isabel assessed the damage. The death was ruled a tragic accident, a freak drowning caused by a faulty pool system. No one thought to question Isabel, who had spent the past 16 years perfecting the art of being invisible. Gabriela's murder, the final act, was the one Isabel had anticipated most. Gabriela, the golden child, the family's shining star, was the embodiment of everything Isabel hated. The night of her death, Isabel waited until a storm rolled in, the thunder masking the creaks of the house as she crept toward Gabriela's room. The balcony railing, which Isabel had loosened days earlier, was slick with rain, the screws barely holding it in place. Gabriela was pacing back and forth, her phone pressed to her ear as she argued with someone on the other end of the line. Isabel lingered in the shadows, her breath shallow as she watched her sister. When the timing felt right, she stepped onto the balcony, startling Gabriela. who turned to face her with a look of confusion. Isabel didn't say a word. She reached out and shoved Gabriella hard, her hands trembling as they made contact with her sister's shoulder. Gabriella stumbled, her arms flailing as she tried to grab the railing, but it gave way instantly, sending her plunging to the ground below. The sound of her body hitting the wet grass was muffled by the rain, and Isabel stood motionless, staring down at what she had done. When the family found Gabriella's broken body, the storm was still raging. Antonio screamed, Marisol collapsed to her knees, and the neighbors gathered once again, their faces pale with shock. This time, however, Isabel's carefully constructed facade began to crack. Detectives noticed the loosened screws on the balcony, the faint smudges of Isabel's fingerprints on the wood. The first two had been wet. Suspicion began to creep in, and the perfect mask Isabel had worn for so long started to slip, revealing the darkness underneath. The beginning of the end for Isabel Martinez started with a single overlooked detail, an insignificant thread that began to unravel the carefully constructed tapestry of lies she had woven. For weeks, Isabel had moved through her house like a specter, her every action calculated, her every expression rehearsed. Emily and Sophia were gone, their deaths written off as tragic accidents that shattered the Martinez family, but left Isabel's role in them undiscovered. Gabriella's death, however, was different. It was bolder, more personal, and far messier than Isabel had planned. It was this final act that lit the first spark of suspicion, and soon that spark grew into a flame that threatened to consume her. The night Gabriella died had been stormy, with heavy rain battering the windows and thunder rumbling across the Florida sky. Isabel had staged the scene meticulously. She had loosened the screws on the balcony railing days earlier, ensuring it would give way under Gabriella's weight. And when her eldest sister fell to her death that night, the storm provided the perfect cover, masking any sounds and creating the ideal conditions for the tragedy Isabel had envisioned. The family discovered Gabriella's body the next morning, crumpled on the patio beneath the balcony. The police ruled it an accident, citing the slick, rain-soaked wood and the faulty railing as the likely cause. Isabel had once again escaped suspicion, or so she thought. But Gabriella's death, unlike the others, left behind ripples that were harder to contain. The first seeds of doubt were planted by Gabriella's friends, who couldn't reconcile the Gabriella they had known, a careful, deliberate perfectionist, with the idea that she would have leaned against a loose railing in the middle of a storm. A close friend came forward, mentioning that Gabriella had recently confided in her about Isabel. She had described their relationship as strained, and hinted that Isabel's behavior had grown more erratic in recent months. While the comment was vague, it was enough to prompt investigators to revisit Isabel's alibi and look closer at the circumstances surrounding the other two deaths in the family. Isabel, meanwhile, sensed the shifting atmosphere in the house. Her parents, who had been too consumed by grief to notice much before, were beginning to pay attention. Marisol, once so quick to dismiss Isabel's quiet, withdrawn nature, started watching her more closely, her maternal instincts finally catching up to the cracks in Isabel's facade. Antonio, who had always been more detached, began to question the sheer improbability of losing 3 daughters in such a short span of time. The air in the house grew heavy with unspoken tension, and Isabel felt the walls closing in. She could see it in the way her parents looked at her, their gazes lingering a moment too long, their voices soft with concern but tinged with something sharper. What Isabel didn't know was that the police had reopened Emily's case, spurred by the inconsistencies they were beginning to piece together. A forensic toxicologist, reviewing Emily's autopsy report, found something that had been initially overlooked: trace amounts of a substance that had no business being in a child's bloodstream. It was faint, almost undetectable, but it was enough to warrant further investigation. The medical examiner revisited Sophia's death as well, finding discrepancies in the pool's drain system that didn't match the manufacturer's specifications. The idea that these deaths were purely coincidental was beginning to crumble, replaced by a far more chilling theory. As the investigation gained momentum, Isabel's behavior began to betray her. Her once practiced calm gave way to paranoia. her every move shadowed by the fear of discovery. She avoided her parents as much as possible, retreating to her room for hours on end, her mind racing with contingency plans. She knew the police were asking questions, knew they had started piecing things together. Her laptop, which she had meticulously wiped clean of incriminating evidence, suddenly felt like a liability. One night, in a panic, she dismantled it, smashing the hard drive with a hammer before discarding the pieces in the trash. But her efforts to cover her tracks only deepened the suspicion around her. Marisol found the broken pieces the next morning and showed them to Antonio, who could no longer deny that something was very wrong. The breaking point came when police obtained a search warrant for Isabel's room. She had underestimated how deeply investigators would dig, how determined they would be to find answers. They combed through every inch of her belongings, uncovering fragments of her plan that she hadn't realized she had left behind. There were pages torn from her sketchbooks, filled with dark, chaotic imagery that mirrored her thoughts in the weeks leading up to the murders. A half-empty bottle of a rarely purchased household chemical, matching the substance found in Emily's autopsy, was hidden in the back of her closet. But the most damning discovery came when they retrieved her phone. Despite her efforts to delete incriminating searches, forensic experts recovered fragments of her online activity, searches for untraceable poisons, how to loosen screws on a balcony, and accidental drowning staging. When the police confronted Isabel with the evidence, her carefully constructed world collapsed. She tried to deny it at first, but her lies faltered under the weight of the truth. The investigators pressed her, their questions sharp and unrelenting, until she finally broke. The confession came haltingly at first, a jumbled mix of justifications and excuses. She blamed Gabriella's cruelty, her parents' neglect, and the years of feeling invisible in a family that had never valued her. She painted herself as a victim, driven to desperation by circumstances beyond her control. But as she spoke, the investigators saw her for what she truly was, not just a victim of her own insecurities, but a cold, calculated killer who had turned on her own family. Isabel's arrest sent shockwaves through the community. The Martinez family, once the picture of perfection, was now irreparably broken, their darkest secrets laid bare for the world to see. Neighbors who had once envied the Martinezes whispered in hushed tones, their perfect image now shattered. For Antonio and Marisol, the realization that their daughter had been behind the deaths of her sisters was too much to bear. As everyone finished dinner, I took paleo. The grief that had already consumed them deepened into something darker, a hollow, unbearable pain that no amount of time could heal. As Isabel sat alone in a holding cell, waiting for the trial that would seal her fate, she replayed the events in her mind. She thought about the moments where everything had gone wrong, the mistakes she had made, the ways her plan had unraveled. And yet, even as she faced the reality of what she had done, she couldn't bring herself to feel remorse. In her mind, she had only done what she had to do to be seen, to matter. But now, as the walls of her cell closed in around her, she was left with the bitter truth. In trying to carve out her place in the world, she had destroyed everything, including herself. The aftermath of Isabel Martinez's arrest was like the wake of a hurricane, chaotic, devastating, and impossible to ignore. The once pristine image of the Martinez family had been obliterated, replaced by a sordid tale of betrayal and tragedy that captivated both the local community and the national media. News outlets descended upon Sarasota, broadcasting every sordid detail of the story. The quiet, artistic middle child who had harbored resentment so deep it drove her to murder her own sisters. The grieving parents who had unwittingly ignored the warning signs. The seemingly perfect family that had been torn apart from within. Their sprawling Mediterranean-style home, with its terracotta roof and manicured lawn, became a symbol of fractured perfection, a place where unimaginable darkness had festered beneath a gleaming surface. For Antonio and Marisol, the weight of their grief was unbearable. They had already buried 3 daughters, but Isabel's arrest forced them to confront a new, incomprehensible reality. Their surviving child, the one they had overlooked for so long, had been the one responsible. The discovery cut deeper than any loss they had endured, leaving them raw and hollow. Marisol, once the heart of the family, became a ghost of herself. She stopped cooking, stopped cleaning, stopped leaving the house. Her days were spent in a daze, staring at old photographs of her daughters, her mind replaying every moment she might have missed, every sign she should have seen. Antonio, though outwardly stoic, struggled in his own way. He buried himself in work, taking on endless projects to avoid being at home, where the silence was deafening. He was guilty. He refused to take responsibility for his own actions because he knew I was lying. When the laughter, the chatter, the chaos that had once filled their home had been replaced by an oppressive void. The house itself became a monument to loss. Emily's stuffed animals still sat on her bed, untouched since the day she died. Sophia's swimming trophies gathered dust on her shelf, their gleaming surfaces dulled by neglect. Gabriella's piano stood silent in the corner of the living room, its polished keys never played again. The echoes of their absence lingered in every corner, a constant reminder of what had been stolen from them. Marisol and Antonio couldn't bear to pack away their daughter's belongings, but neither could they face them. The house, once so full of life, became a mausoleum of memories, frozen in time. The trial was swift and brutal. Isabel was tried as an adult, her crimes too severe to be treated with the leniency of juvenile justice. Prosecutors painted her as a cold, calculating killer, driven by jealousy and resentment. They presented the evidence with precision: the poisoned glass of milk that ended Emily's life, the tampered pool drain that trapped Sophia underwater, the loosened screws on Gabriella's balcony railing. Each piece of evidence was a dagger to her parents' hearts, a reminder of the cold, deliberate nature of her actions. Isabel's defense team argued that she was a deeply troubled young woman, a victim of emotional neglect and mental illness, but the jury was unmoved. The sheer premeditation of her crimes left no room for. Isabel showed little emotion during the trial, her face a mask of indifference. But those who watched her closely noticed the cracks in her composure, the tightening of her jaw, the way her hands trembled when the photographs of her sisters were shown. The verdict came quickly: guilty on all counts. Isabel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the sentence was read, Marisol sobbed quietly into Antonio's shoulder, her body racked with grief. Isabel didn't flinch. She simply stared ahead, her face unreadable, as though she had already made peace with her fate. But as she was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, she glanced back at her parents. For a fleeting moment, there was something in her eyes. Regret, perhaps, or a silent plea for understanding? But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind only the hollow shell of the girl they had once known. In the months that followed, the Martinez family became a cautionary tale, their story dissected and analyzed by everyone from true crime enthusiasts to armchair psychologists. The media speculated endlessly about what could have driven Isabel to commit such heinous acts. Was it the pressure of living in her sister's shadow? The isolation of being the quiet, overlooked child? Or was it something darker, something inherent in her nature? Experts debated the role of mental illness, family dynamics, and societal pressures, but no one could agree on a definitive answer. Isabel herself refused to give interviews or explain her motives, leaving the world to draw its own conclusions. For the Martinez family, the attention was unbearable. The stares of neighbors, the whispered conversations in grocery store aisles, the reporters who lingered outside their home, it all became too much. Antonio and Marisol eventually sold the house, unable to endure the constant reminders of their pain. They moved to a smaller, more modest home in a neighboring town, hoping to find some semblance of peace in anonymity. But the wounds Isabel had inflicted ran too deep to heal. Their marriage, once a source of strength, began to fracture under the weight of their shared guilt and grief. Marisol blamed herself for not seeing the signs, for not protecting her daughters. Antonio buried his guilt beneath layers of anger, lashing out at the world for taking everything from him. They drifted apart, two broken people unable to mend the cracks in their lives. Isabel, meanwhile, faded into obscurity within the walls of a maximum security prison. Her life became a monotonous cycle of gray walls, fluorescent lights, and whispered conversations in the cafeteria. She kept to herself, spending most of her time drawing in the prison's art room, her sketches darker and more haunting than ever before. To the guards and inmates, she was an enigma, a quiet, unassuming girl who seemed out of place among hardened criminals. But those who dared to look closer saw the depth of her bitterness, the cold detachment in her eyes. Isabel never spoke about her sisters, never explained why she did what she did. The only clues to her thoughts were in her drawings, which depicted fractured families, shattered glass, and lone figures standing in the shadows. The Martinez family's story eventually faded from the headlines, replaced by new tragedies, new scandals. But for those who had lived through it, the scars remained. Antonio and Marisol lived out their days in quiet grief, their once bright lives dimmed by the shadow of their past. Isabel remained a mystery, her silence a reminder that some questions can never truly be answered. We shared in our doubt of the moment when Antonio had left our lives. We wrote in silence a reminder that some questions can never truly be answered. And the house in Sarasota, now occupied by strangers, stood as a silent witness to the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. A reminder that even the most perfect facades can hide the darkest secrets.